The papacy, one of the world's oldest continuing institutions, has been led by men of extraordinary sanctity and wisdom throughout much of its history. However, like any human institution spanning nearly 2 millennia, it has also endured periods of moral corruption, political intrigue, and spiritual bankruptcy. The stories of the worst popes reveal how power, unchecked by accountability, can corrupt even those who claim to represent divine authority on earth. The Borgia dynasty, Pope Alexander VI, 1492 to 1503. Perhaps no papal name evokes more scandal than that of Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI. Born in Spain around 1431, Rodrigo's path to the papacy was paved with nepotism, bribery, and political maneuvering. His uncle, Pope Calixtus III, appointed him cardinal at the unprecedented age of 25, setting the stage for a career that would epitomize corruption in the church. Alexander VI's pontificate was marked by shameless nepotism and open acknowledgement of his illegitimate children. He fathered at least 7 children with various mistresses, most notably with Vanozza de Catane, who bore him 4 children including the infamous Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. Unlike previous popes who discreetly maintained relationships, Alexander VI openly acknowledged his children and used the papacy's resources to advance their political careers. The pope's son Cesare became a cardinal at 18, then abandoned his clerical status to become a military commander, conquering territories throughout central Italy with papal armies. Lucrezia Borgia was married multiple times in arrangements that served her father's political ambitions, with one marriage annulled under questionable circumstances and another ending when her husband was allegedly murdered on Cesare's orders. Alexander VI's court became synonymous with excess and debauchery. Contemporary accounts describe elaborate banquets featuring courtesans, with the Pope himself participating in activities that shocked even the relatively permissive Renaissance society. The infamous Banquet of Chestnuts in 1501 allegedly featured naked courtesans crawling on the floor collecting chestnuts, with the Pope offering prizes for sexual acts performed in his presence. Political corruption reached new heights under Alexander VI. He sold cardinalships to the highest bidders, appointed relatives to key positions regardless of qualifications, and used church funds as his personal treasury. The sale of indulgences became systematized, with different sins assigned specific prices. He also divided the New World between Spain and Portugal through papal bulls, treating vast territories and their inhabitants as papal property to be distributed at will. The Pope's military campaigns throughout Italy were funded by church revenues and involved brutal warfare against fellow Christians. Alexander VI allied with France against Italian city-states, then switched sides when convenient, treating the papacy as a temporal power rather than a spiritual authority. His armies committed atrocities in the name of expanding papal territories, with civilians suffering under the weight of his political ambitions. Alexander VI's death in 1503 was surrounded by rumors of poisoning, though modern historians believe he likely died of malaria. His pontificate left the papacy's spiritual authority severely damaged and the church's finances depleted. The Borgia name became synonymous with corruption, inspiring countless works of literature and art that depicted the depths to which the papal office had fallen. The Cadaver Synod, Stephen VI, 896 to 897. One of history's most bizarre and macabre papal incidents occurred under Stephen VI, whose brief pontificate was dominated by an event so strange it seems almost fictional. The Cadaver Synod of 897 represents perhaps the most grotesque moment in papal history, revealing the depths of political hatred and theological absurdity that could consume the church. Stephen VI's primary obsession was posthumously condemning his predecessor, Pope Formosus, who had died in 896. Formosus had been a politically controversial figure, involved in the complex power struggles between various Italian noble families and the Carolingian Empire. His papal legitimacy had been questioned by opponents who viewed his election as invalid due to his previous positions and political alliances. In January 897, Stephen VI ordered that Formosus's corpse be exhumed from its tomb in St. Peter's Basilica. Peter's Basilica. The decomposed body was dressed in papal vestments and placed on a throne in the papal court, where it was put on trial for perjury, violating canon law, and ascending to the papacy illegally. A deacon was appointed to speak for the silent defendant, creating a surreal courtroom scene that shocked even medieval sensibilities. The trial proceeded with Stephen VI screaming accusations at the corpse, demanding answers from the rotting remains of his predecessor. The charges included violation of canon law for moving from one bishopric to another, performing invalid ordinations, and generally conducting himself in a manner unbecoming of the papal office. The appointed defender could only remain silent, as speaking for the dead was considered both impossible and blasphemous. Unsurprisingly, Formosus was found guilty of all charges. Stephen VI ordered that all of the dead pope's acts be declared null and void, meaning that all ordinations performed by Formosus were invalid. The papal vestments were stripped from the corpse, and the 3 fingers used for blessing were severed. The mutilated remains were initially buried in a cemetery for foreigners, then later thrown into the Tiber River. The Cadaver Synod had far-reaching consequences beyond its immediate grotesqueness. All clergy ordained by Formosus were declared invalidly ordained, creating chaos throughout the church hierarchy. Bishops found themselves without legitimate authority, priests discovered their ordinations were meaningless, and the entire structure of church governance was thrown into question. The ripple effects continued for years as subsequent popes struggled to address the canonical nightmare created by Stephen VI's vindictive obsession. Public reaction to the Cadaver Synod was overwhelmingly negative. Romans were horrified by the desecration of papal remains and the mockery of judicial proceedings. The event was seen as evidence of Stephen VI's mental instability and unfitness for the papal office. Contemporary chroniclers describe the trial as evidence of divine judgment against the church, with some viewing it as a sign of the approaching end times. Stephen VI's pontificate ended abruptly in August 897 when he was imprisoned and later strangled in his cell. His death was likely orchestrated by supporters of Formosus, who viewed the Cadaver Synod as an unforgivable desecration. The new pope, Theodore II, immediately reversed Stephen VI's decisions, ordering Formosus's body to be retrieved from the Tiber and reburied with full papal honors. The pleasure-seeking pontiff, John XII, 955 to 964. John XII became pope at approximately age 18, representing the extreme youth and inexperience that characterized some of the worst papal appointments. Born Octavian of Spoleto, he was the son of Alberic II, the ruler of Rome, who had secured his son's future papal election through political maneuvering. When Octavian became Pope John XII in 955, he brought to the office an unprecedented level of hedonism and worldliness that shocked even his contemporary critics. The young pope's behavior was more befitting a secular prince than a spiritual leader. Contemporary accounts describe John XII as obsessed with hunting, gambling, and sexual conquest. He allegedly turned the Lateran Palace into a brothel, conducting orgies within the sacred walls of the papal residence. The Pope was accused of rape, including the violent assault of female pilgrims who came to Rome seeking spiritual guidance. John XII's sexual appetite was legendary even by the standards of his time. He allegedly had affairs with his father's concubine, his own niece, and countless other women. The Pope was said to have given away church property and treasures to his mistresses, treating the papal treasury as his personal fund for supporting his lifestyle. Contemporary chroniclers reported that respectable women feared to visit Rome lest they fall victim to the Pope's advances. The Pope's religious observance was minimal at best. He was accused of never saying Mass or prayers, of gambling and drinking to excess, and of invoking pagan gods while playing dice. John XII allegedly toasted the devil during banquets and invoked Venus and Jupiter while gaming. His theological knowledge was reportedly so poor that he couldn't properly perform basic papal duties, relying on others to handle the spiritual aspects of his office. Political incompetence compounded John XII's moral failures. Faced with threats from Berengar of Italy, the Pope appealed to Otto I of Germany for military assistance. When Otto arrived in Rome, John XII crowned him Holy Roman Emperor in 962, but then immediately began plotting against his new ally. The Pope's treachery was so blatant that Otto was forced to return to Rome to address the situation. In 963, Otto I convened a synod to address John XII's conduct. The charges brought against the Pope were extensive and shocking: sacrilege, simony, perjury, murder, adultery, and incest. Witnesses testified to specific incidents of violence and sexual assault. The Pope was accused of ordaining a deacon in a stable, of castrating and then murdering a cardinal, and of setting fires for entertainment. John XII refused to appear before the synod to defend himself, instead fleeing Rome with the papal treasury. In his absence, the synod deposed him and elected Pope Leo VIII as his replacement. However, John XII returned to Rome in 964 with armed supporters, briefly regaining control of the city. He immediately began executing those who had supported his deposition, including bishops and laypeople who had testified against him. The Pope's reign of terror was short-lived. In May 964, John XII died suddenly at age 27. Contemporary accounts vary regarding the cause of his death, with some claiming he died of a stroke while committing adultery, others suggesting he was murdered by a jealous husband, and still others claiming he was killed by the devil himself. Regardless of the exact circumstances, his death was widely viewed as divine judgment against his corrupt pontificate. The schismatic Pope Clement VII, 1378 to 1394. The Western Schism represents one of the most damaging periods in church history, and Clement VII played a central role in creating and perpetuating this crisis. Born Robert of Geneva, he became Pope Clement VII in 1378 as part of a disputed papal election that split the Catholic Church for nearly 4 decades. While both claimants to the papacy during this period have been criticized, Clement VII's actions were particularly destructive to church unity and Christian faith. The crisis began when Pope Gregory XI returned the papacy from Avignon to Rome in 1377, ending the Babylonian captivity that had seen the papal court residing in France for nearly 70 years. When Gregory XI died in 1378, the Roman people demanded an Italian pope, leading to the election of Urban VI. However, Urban VI's harsh reforms and abrasive personality alienated the cardinals, who declared his election invalid and elected Clement VII as a rival pope. Clement VII's response to the disputed election was to establish a competing papal court in Avignon, creating 2 lines of papal succession that would persist for decades. Rather than seeking compromise or submitting the dispute to a general council, Clement VII actively worked to legitimize his claim through political alliances and military action. He secured the support of France, Scotland, and several Spanish kingdoms, while Urban VI retained the allegiance of England, Germany, and most of Italy. The schism created profound theological and practical problems throughout Christendom. Catholics found themselves unsure which pope to obey, with different regions following different papal lines. The sacrament's validity was questioned, as priests and bishops weren't certain whether their ordinations were legitimate. Church law became confused, with competing papal decrees creating contradictory requirements for the faithful. Clement VII's efforts to resolve the crisis through violence proved particularly damaging. He hired mercenary armies to fight against Urban VI's forces, turning the papal dispute into a military conflict. The spectacle of rival popes excommunicating each other and their supporters scandalized Christians throughout Europe. The papal office, which was supposed to represent Christ's peace on earth, became associated with warfare and division. The financial costs of maintaining rival papal courts were enormous. Both Clement VII and Urban VI needed to fund their administrations, military campaigns, and diplomatic efforts. This led to increased taxation of the clergy, more aggressive sale of indulgences, and greater pressure on the faithful to provide financial support. The church's resources were diverted from pastoral care and charitable works to supporting the competing papacies. Clement VII's personality and governing style exacerbated the crisis. Unlike Urban VI, who was criticized for his harsh reforms, Clement VII was seen as too worldly and politically motivated. His court at Avignon was characterized by luxury and excess, contrasting sharply with the austere traditions many expected from papal leadership. His decisions appeared driven more by political calculation than spiritual conviction. The schism's impact on popular faith was devastating. Many Christians lost confidence in the institutional church, turning to alternative forms of spirituality or questioning religious authority altogether. The scandal of rival popes provided ammunition for critics of papal supremacy and contributed to the growth of conciliar movements that sought to limit papal power. The crisis also strengthened secular rulers who could play competing papal claimants against each other. Clement VII died in 1394, but his successors in Avignon continued the schismatic line until 1417. The Western Schism was finally resolved by the Council of Constance, which deposed all competing papal claimants and elected Martin V as the universally recognized pope. However, the damage to papal prestige and church unity took generations to repair. The nepotist, Paul III, 1534 to 1549. While Paul III is often remembered as the pope who initiated the Counter-Reformation and convened the Council of Trent, his pontificate was also marked by extreme nepotism that exemplified the corruption plaguing the Renaissance papacy. Born Alessandro Farnese, he had secured his cardinal's hat through his sister Julia's relationship with Pope Alexander VI, establishing a pattern of family advancement that would characterize his entire career. Paul III's approach to nepotism was systematic and shameless. Almost immediately after his election, he appointed his teenage grandsons Alessandro and Guido Ascanio Sforza as cardinals, despite their complete lack of theological training or spiritual qualifications. Alessandro was only 14 years old when he received the red hat, making him one of the youngest cardinals in church history. The appointment shocked even Renaissance society, which had become accustomed to papal favoritism. The Pope's son, Pier Luigi Farnese, was another beneficiary of papal nepotism. Paul III created him Duke of Parma and Piacenza, carving out a hereditary duchy from church territories. This action violated the principle that church lands belong to all Christians, not to papal families. Pierluigi's violent and tyrannical rule in his duchy further damaged the papal reputation, as his subjects suffered under his cruel governance. Paul III's grandson, Ottavio Farnese, was married to Margaret of Austria, the illegitimate daughter of Emperor Charles V, in a ceremony that cost the church enormous sums. The papal treasury funded elaborate celebrations, expensive gifts, and dowries that enriched the Farnese family at the expense of church resources. The marriage was arranged to serve papal political interests rather than the spiritual needs of the church. The financial costs of Paul III's nepotism were staggering. Contemporary estimates suggest that he spent over 300,000 ducats annually on his family members, an enormous sum that could have funded numerous charitable works or church reforms. The Pope sold church offices, increased taxation on the papal states, and borrowed heavily to support his relatives' lifestyles. The church's debt increased dramatically during his pontificate. Paul III's nepotism extended beyond immediate family members to include distant relatives and associates. He appointed numerous Farnese supporters to key positions throughout the church hierarchy, creating a network of family loyalty that prioritized personal interests over spiritual duties. Episcopal appointments were made based on family connections rather than pastoral qualifications, weakening the church's ability to address the Protestant Reformation. The scandal of Paul III's nepotism provided Protestant reformers with powerful ammunition against the Catholic Church. Martin Luther and other reformers pointed to the Pope's family favoritism as evidence of institutional corruption that proved the need for fundamental reform. The contrast between the Pope's luxurious lifestyle and Christ's teachings on poverty and humility became a central theme in Protestant criticism. Despite initiating important reforms through the Council of Trent, Paul III's nepotism undermined his credibility as a reformer. His attempts to address clerical corruption rang hollow when his own family members exemplified the problems he claimed to be solving. The Pope's inability to reform himself and his household suggested that the institutional church was incapable of meaningful change. The violent Pope, Julius II, 1503 to 1513. Known as the Warrior Pope, Julius II brought unprecedented militarism to the papal office, personally leading armies into battle and treating the papacy as a temporal kingdom to be expanded through conquest. Born Giuliano della Rovere, he became pope with a clear agenda of restoring papal political power through military might, fundamentally altering the nature of papal authority. Julius II's pontificate was characterized by almost constant warfare. He personally led papal armies against various Italian city-states, wearing armor and directing battles from horseback. The spectacle of the Vicar of Christ engaging in violent conquest scandalized many Christians who expected their spiritual leader to embody Christ's teachings of peace and love. Contemporary accounts describe the Pope's enthusiasm for military strategy and his joy in territorial conquests. The Pope's military campaigns were brutal and destructive. His siege of Bologna in 1506 resulted in significant civilian casualties and the destruction of numerous religious buildings. The papal armies under Julius II's command committed atrocities against fellow Christians, including the massacre of prisoners and the looting of churches. The Pope's quest for political dominance caused immense suffering throughout Italy. Julius II's approach to diplomacy was equally aggressive. He formed and broke alliances based solely on military advantage, treating international relations as extensions of warfare. The Pope's famous quote, "I will not allow anyone to interfere with my plans," reflected his authoritarian approach to leadership. His diplomatic correspondence was filled with threats and ultimatums, rather than the pastoral language expected from a spiritual leader. The financial costs of Julius II's military campaigns were enormous. He spent vast sums on weapons, fortifications, and mercenary armies, diverting church resources from charitable works and spiritual activities. The Pope increased taxation throughout the Papal States, sold church offices to raise funds, and borrowed heavily to finance his wars. The church's debt grew dramatically under his military leadership. Julius II's violence extended to his personal relationships with other church leaders. He physically attacked cardinals who opposed his policies, once striking Cardinal Alidossi so violently that the man died from his injuries. The Pope's violent temper and willingness to use physical force against subordinates created an atmosphere of fear within the church hierarchy. The Pope's military focus came at the expense of spiritual duties. Julius II rarely celebrated Mass, spent minimal time in prayer or meditation, and showed little interest in pastoral care. His sermons, when he gave them, focused on political themes rather than spiritual instruction. The papal court became militarized, with soldiers and weapons replacing the scholarly and spiritual advisors traditional to the papal household. Julius II's legacy includes significant artistic patronage, including commissioning Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling and beginning construction of the new saint, Peter's Basilica. However, these cultural achievements were overshadowed by his transformation of the papacy into a military institution. His example encouraged subsequent popes to view themselves as temporal rulers rather than spiritual leaders. The simony specialist Benedict IX, 1032 to 1048. Benedict IX holds the unique distinction of being the only pope to serve 3 separate terms, a situation that arose from his corrupt practices and the chaotic state of the medieval papacy. Born Theophylactus of Tusculum, he became pope at approximately age 20 through his family's political influence and vast financial resources. His pontificate, characterized by extreme corruption and moral depravity, represents one of the lowest points in papal history. Benedict IX's first term began around 1032 when he was installed as pope through his family's bribery of Roman nobles and clergy. The Tusculan family had effectively purchased the papal office, treating it as hereditary property rather than a spiritual calling. The young pope's lack of theological training and spiritual formation was immediately apparent, as he showed no interest in the religious duties of his office. The pope's behavior scandalized even the relatively permissive medieval society. Contemporary chroniclers described Benedict IX as living in open debauchery, hosting orgies in the papal palace, and engaging in acts of violence and sexual assault. The papal court became a center of corruption, with church offices sold to the highest bidders and church revenues diverted to fund the pope's luxurious lifestyle. Benedict IX's simony was systematic and shameless. He sold bishoprics, abbacies, and other church positions to wealthy candidates regardless of their qualifications or spiritual fitness. The Pope treated church offices as commercial commodities, establishing fixed prices for different positions and creating a bureaucracy to manage the sale of ecclesiastical appointments. This practice corrupted the entire church hierarchy as unsuitable candidates purchased their way into positions of spiritual authority. Political opposition to Benedict IX's corruption eventually forced him from Rome in 1044. The Roman nobles and clergy, disgusted by his behavior, elected Sylvester III as a rival pope. However, Benedict IX returned with armed supporters in 1045, violently reclaiming the papal throne and executing those who had opposed him. His brief second reign was marked by increased brutality and corruption. The most shocking episode of Benedict IX's career occurred in 1045 when he decided to marry his cousin. Recognizing that marriage was incompatible with the papal office, he arranged to sell the papacy to his godfather, Gregory VI, for a substantial sum. This transaction represented the ultimate corruption of the papal office, as the spiritual leadership of Christianity was literally bought and sold like a commercial commodity. Benedict IX's attempted resignation and sale of the papacy created a complex canonical situation. While Gregory VI acted as pope, Benedict IX continued to claim papal authority and even attempted to reclaim the office. The situation was further complicated when a third claimant, Sylvester III, also asserted papal rights. The spectacle of three simultaneous popes, all with questionable claims to legitimacy, scandalized Christendom. The resolution of the Benedict IX crisis required imperial intervention. Emperor Henry III convened the Synod of Sutri in 1046, which deposed all three papal claimants and elected Clement II as pope. However, Benedict IX was not finished with his papal ambitions. When Clement II died in 1047, Benedict IX seized Rome once again, beginning his third and final term as pope. Benedict IX's third pontificate lasted only 8 months before he was definitively expelled from Rome in 1048. His repeated attempts to reclaim the papal office through violence and bribery had exhausted even his supporters' patience. The new pope, Damasus II, and his successor, Leo IX, worked to restore papal credibility after the scandal of Benedict IX's multiple terms. The Borgia connection, Cesare Borgia's papal ambitions. While Cesare Borgia never became pope himself, his relationship with his father, Pope Alexander VI, created one of history's most corrupt papal administrations. Born around 1475, Cesare was made a cardinal by his father at age 18, despite having no religious vocation or theological training. His subsequent career as a military commander and political schemer, supported by papal resources, exemplified the transformation of the church into a family business. Cesare's appointment as cardinal was purely nepotistic, designed to advance the Borgia family's political interests rather than serve the church's spiritual needs. As cardinal, he showed no interest in religious duties, instead focusing on military strategy and political intrigue. His behavior scandalized the College of Cardinals, as he openly maintained mistresses, fathered children, and engaged in violent conflicts with other noble families. The resources Alexander VI devoted to his son's career were staggering. Papal armies were placed under Cesare's command, church territories were conquered to create duchies for him, and vast sums from the papal treasury funded his military campaigns. The Pope's foreign policy was subordinated to his son's ambitions, with diplomatic alliances formed and broken based on their usefulness to Cesare's territorial expansion. Cesare's military campaigns throughout central Italy were marked by extreme brutality. His conquest of the Romagna region involved the systematic elimination of local rulers through assassination, betrayal, and warfare. The papal armies under his command committed atrocities against civilian populations, with entire cities sacked and their inhabitants killed or enslaved. The violence was justified as necessary for church interests, but served only the Borgia family's political ambitions. The corruption surrounding Cesare's career extended throughout the church hierarchy. Bishops and cardinals who opposed Borgia policies were eliminated through poison, assassination, or exile. Church offices were sold to raise funds for Cesare's campaigns, and church law was manipulated to legitimize his actions. the papal administration became indistinguishable from a criminal organization. Cesare's relationship with his sister Lucrezia Borgia added another layer of scandal to the papal court. Rumors of incestuous relationships between the siblings, while possibly exaggerated, reflected the moral chaos that characterized Alexander VI's pontificate. The Pope's inability to maintain even basic moral standards within his own family undermined his authority as a spiritual leader. The international implications of Cesare's actions were enormous. His military campaigns destabilized Italy, contributing to the Italian wars that would devastate the peninsula for decades. Foreign powers were drawn into Italian conflicts partly because of Cesare's territorial ambitions, leading to widespread destruction and suffering. The papacy's reputation throughout Europe was severely damaged by its association with his violent career. Cesare's influence on church policy was profound and destructive. Church resources were diverted from charitable works and pastoral care to fund his military ambitions. The sale of indulgences was systematized to generate revenue for his campaigns, contributing to the spiritual crisis that would eventually fuel the Protestant Reformation. The Church's credibility as a moral authority was compromised by its support for his criminal activities. The Medici Pope, Leo X, 1513 to 1521. Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici, became pope during a critical period when the Church faced the emerging Protestant Reformation. While not as overtly corrupt as some of his predecessors, his worldly approach to the papacy and his handling of the Luther crisis contributed significantly to the religious divisions that would permanently split Western Christianity. Leo X's election reflected the continued influence of wealthy Italian families in papal politics. The Medici family had spent enormous sums securing his cardinalate and eventual papal election, viewing the papacy as an extension of their banking and political empire. The new pope's background was more commercial than spiritual, with his theological education subordinated to training in finance and diplomacy. The pope's lifestyle was extravagantly expensive, reflecting his background as a member of one of Europe's wealthiest families. Contemporary accounts describe elaborate banquets, expensive art collections, and lavish entertainment that consumed vast amounts of church revenue. Leo X's famous comment, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," captured his approach to the papal office as a source of personal pleasure rather than spiritual responsibility. Leo X's financial management of the Church was disastrous. He inherited a papal debt of 400,000 ducats and increased it to over 800,000 ducats during his pontificate. The Pope's spending on luxury items, artistic patronage, and family advancement far exceeded church revenues. His solution was to increase the sale of indulgences, creating the financial incentives that would ultimately provoke Martin Luther's protest. The Pope's response to the Protestant Reformation was characterized by political calculation rather than spiritual concern. When Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, Leo X initially dismissed the controversy as a squabble among monks. His failure to recognize the theological significance of Luther's protest, focusing instead on the financial threat to indulgence sales, demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of the spiritual crisis facing the Church. Leo X's excommunication of Luther in 1521 was based more on political considerations than theological disagreement. The Pope was primarily concerned with maintaining papal authority and church revenue rather than addressing the legitimate spiritual concerns raised by the reformers. His inflexible response to calls for reform contributed to the permanent split between Catholic and Protestant Christianity. The Pope's nepotism continued the pattern established by his predecessors. He appointed numerous Medici family members to key church positions, including making his cousin Giulio de' Medici a cardinal, who would later become Pope Clement VII. Church offices were distributed based on family connections rather than spiritual qualifications, perpetuating the corruption that reformers criticized. Leo X's pontificate coincided with the height of Renaissance art and culture, and he was a significant patron of artists, including Raphael and Michelangelo. However, his cultural patronage was funded by church revenues that could have been used for charitable works or addressing the spiritual needs of the faithful. The contrast between papal luxury and Christian poverty provided powerful ammunition for Protestant critics. The long-term consequences of Leo X's pontificate were enormous. His financial mismanagement created a crisis that subsequent popes struggled to address. His failure to respond effectively to the Protestant Reformation allowed the religious split to become permanent, fundamentally altering the landscape of Western Christianity. The corruption and worldliness that characterized his reign provided reformers with justification for their criticism of the institutional church. The stories of these worst popes reveal how power without accountability can corrupt even the most sacred institutions. From the grotesque spectacle of the Cadaver Synod to the systematic corruption of the Borgia papacy, these pontificates demonstrate the dangers of treating spiritual authority as political power. The damage inflicted by these corrupt popes extended far beyond their individual reigns, undermining the Church's credibility for generations and contributing to permanent religious divisions.